The WNBA just learned the most expensive lesson in professional sports history, and it only took 48 hours. When Caitlin Clark went down with a quad injury, the league probably thought fans would stick around, that the momentum would continue, that all those new viewers had somehow become die-hard WNBA supporters. They were catastrophically wrong. Ticket prices didn't just drop, they collapsed by 42% overnight. Fans aren't just disappointed, they're actively boycotting. Teams that bet millions on Clark's drawing power are staring down thousands of empty seats in arenas they specifically upgraded for her arrival. The market has spoken, and what it's saying should terrify every executive in that league office. This isn't just about one injured player. This is about a reckoning that's been building since the day Caitlin Clark entered the league, and the financial devastation is just beginning. The economic collapse happened faster than anyone could have predicted. Within 48 hours of the announcement that Caitlin Clark would miss at least 2 weeks with a quad injury, the secondary ticket market went into freefall. Indiana Fever game tickets that were averaging $137 suddenly dropped 42% in value. But raw numbers only tell part of the story. What's really happening represents a complete market rejection of the WNBA product without its biggest star. Thousands of fans who had purchased tickets months in advance are now flooding resale platforms, desperately trying to recoup any money they can. The message boards and social media platforms are filled with supporters openly stating they have zero interest in attending games if Clark isn't playing. One fan from the DC area wrote that they were immediately selling their Mystics vs. Fever tickets because making the trip to Baltimore without seeing Clark perform simply wasn't worth the time or expense. Another declared they would only watch Fever games on delay until Clark returns, specifically to deny the league their live viewership metrics. This isn't the behavior of casual disappointment. This is organized resistance from a fanbase that feels betrayed. These supporters showed up for the WNBA when the league needed them most, brought attention and money that women's basketball had been desperately seeking for decades, and in return, they watched as the league seemed almost uncomfortable with where that attention was focused. Now that the player who brought them into the fold is injured, potentially due to mismanagement and overuse, these fans are sending the clearest message possible through their wallets. The teams that made major financial commitments banking on Clark's appearance are facing a nightmare scenario. The Washington Mystics didn't just keep their game at their normal venue, they relocated the entire matchup to a Baltimore facility with 15,000 seats. That decision came with massive additional costs: venue rental fees that dwarf their usual expenses, extra security staffing for a much larger crowd, expanded concessions operations, additional marketing campaigns to promote the special event. All of those investments were calculated based on one assumption: Caitlin Clark would be on that court. The Chicago Sky made a similar gamble, moving their game against Indiana to the United Center, home of the Bulls. The Dallas Wings went even bigger, relocating to the American Airlines Center where the Mavericks play. These aren't minor adjustments or optimistic upgrades. These are massive financial risks that only make sense if you're confident in selling out a significantly larger venue at premium prices. Without Clark, these teams aren't just looking at reduced revenue, they're staring at substantial losses. What makes this situation even worse is the optics. When television cameras show 15,000-seat arenas with only 4,000 people scattered throughout, it doesn't just look bad. It fundamentally undermines the narrative of WNBA growth that the league has been building. Sponsors and television executives don't just look at total attendance numbers. They pay attention to the visual story being told. Empty seats in venues, specifically enlarged for an event, communicate failure at the most basic level of sports business. You couldn't deliver the audience you promised. The secondary market collapse also reveals something the WNBA probably didn't want confirmed so definitively. The vast majority of their recent growth is tied specifically to one player, not to a general increased interest in women's basketball. If fans were genuinely engaged with the league as a whole, ticket values would remain relatively stable. Sure, there might be some decline without a star player, but not a 42% crash in 40. Following the sports industry are taking notes. This situation provides clear data about what happens when a league builds its growth strategy around a single player while simultaneously trying to downplay that player's individual importance. The contradiction creates a fragile foundation, and we're watching it crack in real time. The WNBA spent months insisting that their success was about more than one rookie, that the rising tide was lifting all boats, that the increased attention represented a genuine shift in public interest toward women's basketball as a whole. The market is now calling that bluff, and the answer is devastating. What should worry league executives even more is the organized nature of the response. This isn't passive disappointment where fans simply don't show up. This is active protest where supporters are publicly declaring their intentions to boycott, explaining exactly why they're doing it, and encouraging others to join them. That kind of collective action can create lasting damage that extends well beyond Clark's injury timeline. Once fans disengage and find other entertainment options, bringing them back requires significantly more effort than keeping them engaged in the first place. The WNBA is about to learn that lesson the hard way. Indiana Fever coach Stephanie White delivered the news with careful corporate phrasing. Caitlin Clark has a quad injury and will be reevaluated in 2 weeks. For anyone who's followed timeline for this type of injury runs anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, and that's assuming no setbacks or complications. Clark's playing style puts enormous sideline her completely suggests significant muscle fiber damage that needs proper healing time, not rushed recovery to get her back on the court. What makes this situation especially concerning is the timeline of when the injury occurred. Reports indicate the quad issues first appeared during the preseason, which raises serious questions about whether Clark was fully healthy when the regular season started. If she was already dealing with quad problems and continued playing through discomfort, the current injury might represent a worsening of an existing condition rather than a new acute injury. That possibility makes the recovery timeline even more uncertain. White's comments during the press conference revealed some of the confusion around the injury specifics. When asked when the injury happened, she admitted uncertainty, only knowing that after their last game against the Liberty, they received word that Clark had something going on with her leg. The lack of precise information about when and how the injury occurred is concerning from a medical management standpoint. Professional sports organizations typically track player health metrics obsessively, so this level of ambiguity suggests either poor communication or a gradual deterioration that wasn't being properly monitored. The comparison to NBA injury reporting is particularly relevant here. Anyone who follows professional basketball knows that when teams announce a 2-week reevaluation period, the actual return timeline is usually significantly longer. The Pelicans saying Zion Williamson will be reevaluated in 2 weeks has become a running joke among NBA fans because it rarely means he'll be back in 2 weeks. Organizations use vague language to manage expectations and avoid committing to specific return dates that might not be achievable. The WNBA appears to be following the same playbook, but with much higher stakes. In the NBA, teams have deeper rosters and longer seasons to absorb star player absences. The WNBA season is compressed into just a few months with smaller rosters, meaning every game Clark misses represents a much larger percentage of the total season. More importantly, the league's recent financial momentum is almost entirely dependent on her being on the court. The NBA can survive without any single player. The WNBA, as we're currently seeing, apparently cannot. This raises uncomfortable questions about player management and organizational priorities. Was Clark being overworked to capitalize on the unprecedented interest she was generating? The jump from college basketball to professional play is significant, and rookie players typically need careful load management to prevent exactly this type of injury. Did the Fever and the WNBA prioritize maximizing Clark's availability for business reasons over protecting her long-term health? The financial pressures on the overtly needed. That kind of economic incentive can lead to decision-making that prioritizes short-term gain over long-term player welfare. Nobody wants to believe that happened here, but the circumstantial evidence is concerning. Medical professionals who work in sports medicine will tell you that quad strains often result from accumulated fatigue and inadequate recovery time. The muscle becomes overworked, loses its ability to absorb force properly, and eventually breaks down. If Clark was playing through minor quad discomfort during the preseason and continued with a full game schedule without proper rest and treatment, this injury was predictable and preventable. The lack of transparency around the specific mechanism of injury and the timeline of symptoms is frustrating for fans who genuinely care about Clark's well-being beyond just wanting to watch her play. Was this a single traumatic event during a game, or the final breakdown after weeks of playing through pain? That distinction matters significantly for understanding both the recovery timeline and the organizational decision-making that led to this point. What we do know is that quad injuries for explosive athletes are serious business. These aren't injuries you can push through with pain management and hope for the best. The quadriceps muscles are fundamental to every basketball movement: jumping, cutting, accelerating, decelerating, absorbing contact. Rushing back from this type of injury dramatically increases the risk of re-injury, potentially creating a cycle of problems that could affect Clark's entire season or longer. The 2-week reevaluation timeline should be understood as an absolute best-case scenario, and even that assumes everything goes perfectly with her recovery. More likely, we're looking at a month or more before Clark is genuinely ready to return to full-intensity professional basketball. The WNBA and Indiana Fever can hope for a faster timeline, but hoping doesn't heal muscle tissue. The financial commitments made based on Caitlin Clark's expected presence are now turning into accounting nightmares for multiple WNBA franchises. When teams decided to relocate games to significantly larger venues, they weren't making cautious, conservative business decisions. They were placing major bets that Clark's drawing power would justify the substantial additional expenses. Those bets are about to go catastrophically wrong. Start with the Washington Mystics' decision to move their matchup against Indiana to Baltimore. This wasn't a simple venue change, it was a complete operational overhaul. Moving from their standard arena to a 15,000-seat facility means negotiating an entirely different rental agreement with venue costs that can run into 6 figures for a single event. The larger facility requires dramatically increased security staffing, not just for crowd control, but for managing premium seating areas, VIP sections, and the expanded concourse operations. Concessions operations scale with venue size, meaning the Mystics had to coordinate with vendors to staff and supply food and beverage service for a crowd potentially 3 times larger than their normal attendance. Marketing campaigns for the relocated game consumed budget that might normally cover multiple regular season promotions. Special event promotion requires different advertising strategies, often including regional media buys to reach potential attendees beyond the team's usual geographic fan base. All of those investments were calculated based on projected ticket sales that assumed a sold-out or near sold-out arena at premium prices. Without Clark, the Mystics aren't just failing to hit their optimistic projections, they're likely to draw fewer fans than would have attended at their regular venue, while paying 3 to 4 times the normal operational costs. That's not just missed opportunity, that's direct financial loss. The Chicago Sky's situation with the United Center relocation carries similar risks, but at an even larger scale. The United Center holds over 20,000 people for basketball, and every aspect of operating that facility costs significantly more than the Sky's regular venue. Rental fees for one of the NBA's premier facilities don't come cheap. The additional staffing requirements, from security to ushers to concessions workers, represent enormous labor costs. The marketing push to fill a venue that size requires substantial advertising expenditure across multiple media platforms. Beyond the direct costs, there are opportunity costs and logistical complications. Moving a game to a different venue disrupts normal operations, requires different coordination with transportation and parking facilities, and potentially conflicts with other scheduled events. Teams make these sacrifices when they're confident the financial return justifies the hassle. Without that return, the decision looks increasingly foolish with each ticket that gets refunded or remains unsold. The Dallas Wings made perhaps the boldest venue gamble by moving to the American Airlines Center, home of the Mavericks. This represents maximum financial exposure because operating costs at that facility are calibrated for NBA-level revenue. Everything from basic utilities to service staff wages reflects the economics of a major professional sports franchise. The Wings committed to those costs, expecting Clark-driven sellout crowds that would generate revenue far beyond their normal operations. What happens now when television cameras broadcast these games to whatever audience remains? Instead of showing packed, smaller venues that communicate growing interest in women's basketball, networks will be showing cavernous arenas with huge sections of empty seats. That visual narrative is devastating for a league trying to convince sponsors, media partners, and casual fans that the WNBA is experiencing genuine sustainable growth. Sports marketing executives at major brands pay close attention to these visual cues. When they're evaluating sponsorship opportunities, empty seats signal that fan engagement is weak, that the league can't deliver the audiences they're promising, and that associating their brand with the product carries reputational risk. The WNBA spent the early part of this season building positive momentum with packed arenas and impressive viewership numbers. A few weeks of sparsely attended games in oversized venues could undo months of positive brand building. The teams that made these venue commitments also made them publicly, often with press releases and marketing campaigns highlighting the special events and upgraded facilities. Backing out now isn't really an option. The venues are booked, the promotional materials have been distributed, and retreating to smaller facilities would require admitting the entire premise was flawed. So these teams are locked into hosting games in arenas These venue partnerships often involve multi-year relationships and future booking opportunities. If teams lose substantial money on Clark-related special events, they'll be far more hesitant to make similar commitments in the future, even when she returns. The conservative approach that results will limit the league's ability to capitalize on her star power going forward. Sponsorship activation tied to these special events is also at risk. Brands that paid premium rates for enhanced visibility during highly attended games are now looking at dramatically reduced exposure. Those sponsors will remember when renewal negotiations come around, potentially demanding reduced rates or additional guarantees that protect them from similar situations. The current crisis didn't begin with Caitlin Clark's quad injury. It started the moment she entered the WNBA, and the league couldn't decide whether she was their savior or a problem that needed managing. From day one, there's been a strange tension between capitalizing on Clark's unprecedented popularity and diminishing her individual importance. That contradiction has created the perfect conditions for the current fan rebellion. When Clark was drafted, she arrived with more mainstream name recognition than possibly any player in WNBA history. Her college career had generated viewership numbers that rivaled major men's sporting events. She was already a household name with crossover appeal that extended far beyond traditional women's basketball audiences. Any competent marketing organization would have recognized this as an extraordinary opportunity and structured their entire promotional strategy around maximizing that momentum. Instead, the WNBA approached Clark's arrival with visible ambivalence. Yes, they featured her in promotional materials and highlighted her games in their broadcast schedule. But simultaneously, there was constant messaging about how the league's growth was about more than one player, how other stars deserved attention, how the rising interest represented validation for women's basketball as a whole rather than Clark-specific phenomenon. That defensive posture revealed deep insecurity about the nature of their success. League officials and some players seemed uncomfortable with the reality that one rookie was driving the majority of new interest. There were frequent comments about sharing the spotlight, making sure credit was distributed properly, and ensuring that Clark's success didn't overshadow the broader WNBA narrative. These concerns might have been understandable from an ideological standpoint, but they were terrible business strategy. Sports marketing doesn't work through fair distribution of attention. It works through star power that draws casual fans who might eventually become invested in the broader product. Michael Jordan didn't diminish the NBA. His individual stardom created entry points for millions of fans who became basketball supporters more generally. Tiger Woods brought people to golf who stayed for the sport beyond just watching him. Tom Brady made the NFL appointment viewing for people who became football fans. The path to sustainable league growth runs directly through individual star appeal. You attract casual viewers with transcendent talents, then work to convert them into long-term supporters by showcasing the quality of competition and the compelling narratives throughout the league. The WNBA had a golden opportunity to execute that playbook perfectly with Clark. Instead, they seemed almost resentful of the attention she received. Media coverage reflected this tension. Stories about Clark's impact were frequently accompanied by commentary about how other players were just as talented, how the focus on one rookie was unfair, how the narrative needed to be more inclusive. Players made pointed comments about sharing credit for the league's success. Analysts discussed whether too much attention on Clark was actually harmful to the WNBA's long-term interests. All of that commentary sent a clear message to Clark-specific fans. Your interest is somehow wrong, your focus is too narrow, and you need to broaden your attention to appreciate the league properly. That's an absolutely catastrophic way to treat new audiences who are just beginning their engagement with your product. Instead of welcoming them enthusiastically and working to deepen their connection, the league was essentially scolding them for why they showed up. The business strategy was incoherent. Teams were moving games to larger venues specifically to capitalize on Clark's drawing power, a clear acknowledgement that she was the primary attraction. Television broadcasts were scheduled around Indiana Fever games, tacitly admitting where viewer interest concentrated. Ticket prices for games featuring Clark were substantially higher than other matchups, reflecting basic market economics. But publicly, the league maintained the fiction that this was all about collective growth and rising tides lifting all boats. You can't have it both ways. You can't structure your entire economic model around one player's appeal while simultaneously insisting that player isn't uniquely important. Well, you can try, but eventually the contradiction becomes untenable. That moment has arrived, and it's exposing the fundamental dishonesty of the WNBA's approach. The proper strategy would have been straightforward. Embrace Clark completely, maximize every aspect of her star power, feature her prominently in all marketing while simultaneously working to showcase other compelling players and storylines. Use her appeal as the gateway that brings people into the arena or turns on the television. Then make sure the overall product is strong enough that some percentage of those new viewers become genuine WNBA fans beyond just Clark supporters. Instead, the league tried to have their economic cake while eating their ideological principles too. They wanted Clark's revenue without acknowledging Clark's primacy. They wanted her star power without the implications of admitting one player was carrying the league's growth. That approach satisfied neither business needs nor ideological concerns, and it created deep resentment among the fans who felt the league was disrespecting the player who brought them to women's basketball. The result is what we're seeing now. When Clark goes down, those fans feel zero loyalty to the WNBA as an institution. Why would they? The league spent months telling them their Clark-focused interest was problematic, that they needed to appreciate the broader context, that one player's success was really everyone's success. Fine, if it's everyone's success, then everyone can deal with the attendance and viewership without her. The boycott isn't just about disappointment over an injury. It's about fans who feel the league never really wanted them in the first place, at least not on the terms they were willing to offer. Those supporters showed up for Caitlin Clark, and the WNBA acted like that was somehow insufficient or inappropriate. Now they're learning what the alternative looks like. The statistical evidence of Caitlin Clark's impact on WNBA viewership and attendance isn't subject to interpretation or debate. The numbers are stark, dramatic, and utterly definitive. Before Clark, the league was struggling with viewership that barely registered in the broader sports landscape. With her, games were suddenly drawing audiences that rivaled major sporting events. This wasn't gradual growth or incremental improvement. It was a fundamental transformation of the WNBA's market position. Regular season WNBA games typically attracted around 200,000 television viewers, and that was considered respectable performance for the league. These were niche broadcasts that sports networks carried more out of obligation than enthusiasm, with minimal promotional support and time slots that reflected their secondary importance to the broader programming strategy. The audience was small but dedicated, consisting primarily of hardcore women's basketball supporters who had stuck with the league through decades of minimal mainstream recognition. When Caitlin Clark started playing, those viewership numbers exploded. Games featuring the Indiana Fever were suddenly drawing over 1 million viewers, sometimes approaching 1.5 million for particularly anticipated matchups. That's not a 10% or 20% increase. It's a 400% to 500% jump in audience size. In television economics, that kind of growth is transformative. It moves broadcasts saw genuine marketing value in associating with games that were drawing legitimate television audiences. That shift from charity case to viable commercial product represents the difference between a league that perpetually struggles financially and one that can actually sustain itself on market economics. Attendance figures told the same story. The Indiana Fever were routinely selling out their arena, with thousands of additional fans unable to get tickets. Secondary market prices for Fever games reached levels previously unheard of in women's basketball. Teams hosting Indiana were moving games to larger venues specifically to accommodate demand, understanding that Clark's presence represented a rare opportunity to fill arenas that would normally be far too large for WNBA attendance patterns. Before this season, WNBA teams considered it a success to draw 5,000 fans to a game, or extended well beyond ticket sales and television ratings. Merchandise sales for Clark-related items were outpacing everything else in WNBA history. Her jersey became the fastest-selling in league records. Retailers who had minimal women's basketball inventory were suddenly dedicating substantial shelf and floor space to WNBA products because consumer demand about opportunities specifically tied to Clark's marketability. These weren't small regional sponsors or niche brands making diversity commitments. These were major national companies recognizing genuine commercial potential in associating with women's basketball for the first time. Media coverage expanded beyond sports-specific outlets into mainstream entertainment and culture journalism. Clark was appearing on talk shows, being featured in major publications, and generating social media engagement that rivaled any athlete in professional sports. That crossover appeal is extraordinarily rare and valuable. It represents the difference between being a sports story and being a cultural phenomenon. The television deal negotiations that were happening during this period reflected the transformed market position. Networks were suddenly willing to discuss substantially improved contract terms because they could point to actual viewership data proving that WNBA broadcasts could draw audiences. For decades, the league had been arguing they deserved better media deals based on potential and principles. Clark's impact provided the concrete performance metrics that television executives actually care about. All of this growth, all of these improved business outcomes, all of the momentum that had the WNBA experiencing its best financial period in league history, it was overwhelmingly attributable to one player's impact. That's not diminishing other talented athletes in the league. It's simply acknowledging the market reality that star power drives casual interest in ways that quality competition alone cannot. The WNBA had experienced good players before. They'd had talented rookies, impressive performances, and compelling individual stories. None of it generated anything approaching the commercial impact that Clark produced immediately upon entering the league. The difference wasn't just about basketball skill. It was about crossover appeal, mainstream name recognition, and the ability to make casual sports fans care about women's basketball. What makes the current situation so devastating is that we're about to get a perfect controlled experiment proving Clark's importance. The league will continue playing games, other talented players will continue performing at high levels, and the overall quality of basketball will remain essentially unchanged. The only variable that's different is Clark's absence. When viewership collapses and attendance craters, It will provide definitive proof of what was already obvious. The recent WNBA growth was almost entirely a Caitlin Clark phenomenon, not a rising tide of general interest in women's basketball. League executives probably hoped they'd never have to confront that reality so directly. They wanted to maintain the narrative that Clark was merely the most visible manifestation of broader growth, that her impact was significant but not singular. The market is about to destroy that narrative completely, and the financial consequences will be impossible to ignore or explain away. Understanding why the fan response has been so dramatic requires recognizing a fundamental truth about how the WNBA's recent audience growth actually occurred. The league didn't successfully convert millions of Americans into devoted women's basketball fans who would support the sport regardless of any individual player. What actually happened is that Caitlin Clark attracted a massive following of people who became WNBA viewers specifically because they were Caitlin Clark fans. That distinction is absolutely critical. These casual fans didn't wake up one day and decide they needed to start following women's professional basketball. They weren't convinced by compelling arguments about supporting women's sports or social justice frameworks about equal attention. They became WNBA viewers because they had watched Caitlin Clark dominate college basketball, found her playing style exciting and her personality engaging, and wanted to continue following her career at the professional level. This is not an insult to these fans or a suggestion their interest is somehow less valid. This is simply how sports fandom actually develops for the vast majority of people. Casual viewers are attracted by individual stars whose playing style or personality resonates with them. Some percentage of those casual viewers eventually develop deeper engagement with the sport itself, but that conversion is neither automatic nor guaranteed. It requires intentional effort from the league to provide compelling reasons for star-specific fans to broaden their interest. The WNBA had an extraordinary opportunity to execute this conversion. They had millions of new viewers who were showing up specifically for Clark, but were being exposed to the broader league in the process. Smart marketing would have worked to highlight other compelling players, showcase interesting team rivalries, develop engaging narratives beyond just one star. The goal would be gradually converting "I watch to see Caitlin Clark" into "I watch because WNBA basketball is entertaining and I'm invested in multiple storylines." Instead, the league's messaging often seemed designed to scold Clark-specific fans for not already being invested WNBA supporters. There was constant commentary about how other players deserved attention, how the focus on Clark was disproportionate, how true fans should appreciate the league more broadly. That approach is spectacularly counterproductive when dealing with casual audiences who are just beginning their engagement. Imagine if the NBA in the 1990s had responded to the massive influx of Michael Jordan fans by constantly insisting they should really be paying equal attention to every player in the league. Or if the NFL had scolded Tom Brady fans for not being equally invested in every quarterback. It would have been absurd, and it would have driven away the casual viewers who were creating the commercial success that ultimately benefited the entire league. Star-driven fandom is how sports viewership actually works for the majority of audiences. Hardcore fans who follow entire leagues, track multiple teams, and stay engaged regardless of individual player movements are a minority. The casual majority watches because specific athletes capture their interest. Some of those casual fans eventually become hardcore supporters, but that evolution takes time and requires the league to facilitate it rather than demanding it immediately. The current boycott reflects what happens when casual fans feel unwelcome. These Clark supporters showed up for the WNBA when the league desperately needed them. They bought tickets at unprecedented rates, drove television viewership to historic levels, purchased merchandise, and generated mainstream media attention. In return, they were frequently told their interest was problematic because it was too focused on one player. Now that Clark is injured, those fans feel zero obligation to continue supporting the league. Why would they? They never signed up to be WNBA institutional supporters. They came to watch Caitlin Clark play basketball, and the league made clear that wasn't the right kind of fan interest. Fine, If Clark-specific fandom isn't what the WNBA wanted, they're about to experience what their audience looks like without it. The organized nature of the boycott reveals how deeply this disconnect affected the fan experience. People aren't just passively choosing not to attend games, they're actively organizing opposition, selling tickets, and encouraging others to join them in protest. That level of antagonism doesn't develop from simple disappointment about an injury. It develops from months of feeling disrespected and unwelcome despite bringing unprecedented attention and revenue to the league. Sports organizations should be desperately grateful when casual fans show up for any reason. Those casual viewers represent growth potential, new revenue streams, and the possibility of expanding beyond core audiences. The smart approach is welcoming them enthusiastically, making their experience as positive as possible, and gradually working to deepen their engagement over time. You definitely don't scold them for why they showed up or suggest their interest is insufficient. The WNBA appears to have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their recent success. They seem to have believed that Clark's star power was revealing an underlying demand for women's basketball that had always existed, but needed the right catalyst to emerge. The reality is much simpler. Clark created demand that was specifically about her, and converting that narrow interest into broader support required intentional strategy that the league failed to execute. When Clark returns from injury, will these boycotting fans come back? Some probably will, because their interest in watching her play outweighs their frustration with the league. But others will have moved on, found other entertainment options, and lost the habit of following the WNBA. Regaining lost audiences is exponentially harder than maintaining existing ones. The league is learning that lesson in the most expensive way possible. The fundamental principle is straightforward. Loyalty flows in both directions. Fans who feel respected and valued develop loyalty to organizations. Fans who feel dismissed and unwelcome remain transactional in their engagement. The WNBA had a choice about which type of relationship to build with Clark-specific fans, and they chose poorly. The financial consequences of that choice are now becoming painfully apparent. What makes this entire situation particularly frustrating is how preventable it was. The current crisis isn't the result of bad luck or unforeseen circumstances. It's the entirely predictable outcome of decisions that prioritized short-term revenue extraction over long-term player health and sustainable business strategy. The WNBA and the Indiana Fever created the conditions for this disaster, and they're about to pay an enormous price for it. Start with the injury itself. Quad strains of the severity that require multiple weeks of recovery don't typically appear out of nowhere. They develop through accumulated stress, inadequate recovery time, and playing through early warning signs that should have triggered rest and treatment. Reports indicate Clark was dealing with quad issues during the preseason, which raises obvious questions about whether she should have been playing a full regular season schedule immediately. The transition from college to professional basketball is physically demanding under the best circumstances. The season is longer, the competition is more physical, and the travel schedule is more grueling. Rookie players typically need careful load management to allow their bodies to adapt to the increased demands without breaking down. This is standard practice in professional sports, and there's decades of medical research supporting these protocols. Was Caitlin Clark receiving that careful management, or was the financial pressure to maximize her availability overwhelming the medical considerations? The circumstantial evidence suggests the latter. Every game Clark missed represented substantial lost revenue in ticket sales, television viewership, and media attention. The incentive structure created enormous pressure to keep her on the court regardless of whether that was medically optimal. League officials and team executives will obviously never admit to prioritizing revenue over player health. They'll insist they were following medical advice, that Clark's workload was appropriate, and that the injury was an unforeseeable occurrence. But the pattern of events tells a different story. A player with preseason quad issues playing a full schedule until the injury worsens enough to force extended absence looks exactly like an organization pushing too hard and paying the price. The broader failure was the league's approach to managing Clark's impact on their business. The WNBA had an unprecedented opportunity, a transcendent talent with mainstream appeal who could fundamentally transform their market position. The smart strategy would have been protecting that asset obsessively while simultaneously working to build sustainable growth that didn't depend entirely on one player's availability. Instead, they tried to maximize Clark's short-term revenue generation while publicly denying her singular importance. That contradiction created the worst possible outcome. They worked her hard enough to potentially contribute to injury, alienated her specific fan base with messaging that downplayed her impact, and failed to build the broader fan engagement that could have cushioned the blow of her absence. A competent strategy would have looked entirely different. First, embrace Clark completely. Feature her in every marketing campaign, build promotional strategies around her star power, and publicly celebrate having the most exciting player in women's basketball history. Second, use that platform to showcase other talented players and compelling storylines, working to convert casual Clark fans into broader WNBA supporters. Third, manage her workload carefully to ensure she stays healthy for the long term, recognizing that sustainable success requires keeping your star on the court. The league did essentially the opposite on every count. They featured Clark in marketing, but with obvious discomfort about her dominance of the narrative. They failed to effectively showcase other players that teams could easily absorb if circumstances changed. These were massive financial exposures that only made sense if everything went perfectly. Is fundamentally flawed. The teams that relocated games should have either secured insurance against Clark's absence or structured their commitments in ways that limited downside risk if she couldn't play. Instead, they bet everything on her availability and are now facing the consequences. That's not bad luck, it's bad planning. Professional sports organizations are supposed to understand these risks and manage them appropriately. The current situation suggests a level of organizational incompetence that's almost impressive in its scope. The timing makes everything worse. The WNBA was finally experiencing genuine momentum with improving television deals, increasing sponsorship interest, and mainstream media attention. All of that progress was fragile because it was so dependent on factors the league couldn't fully control. Protecting that momentum required careful stewardship and smart long-term thinking. Instead, we're watching a potential collapse play out in real time. The television ratings for games without Clark will likely return to historical norms, which will disappoint networks that were hoping the growth was sustainable. Sponsors will reconsider partnerships when the audience metrics drop by 75%. Media coverage will decline when there's no compelling storyline to drive clicks and views. Could this have been avoided? Absolutely. With better player health management, smarter business risk planning, more effective fan relationship building, and honest acknowledgement of Clark's importance, the WNBA could have built something sustainable. Instead, they're about to learn expensive lessons about the dangers of short-term thinking and the importance of respecting what actually drives your business success. The next few weeks will provide the most definitive answer possible to a question the WNBA has been avoiding. What is this league actually worth without Caitlin Clark? All the theoretical debates, the arguments about broader growth versus individual star power, the insistence that rising tides lift all boats, all of it is about to be tested against the harsh reality of market performance. The results will be impossible to spin or ignore. Television viewership numbers will be the first clear indicator. Games featuring the Indiana Fever without Clark will likely draw somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 viewers, representing a 60% to 80% decline from the audiences her games were generating. Network executives will notice immediately. Those kinds of drops don't just affect advertising revenue for specific broadcasts. They impact negotiations for future media deals and the willingness of networks to provide favorable time slots and promotional support. When television contracts come up for renewal, network negotiators will have concrete data showing that WNBA viewership without Clark looks essentially identical to pre-Clark historical norms. That evidence will undermine any argument that the league has achieved sustainable growth in audience size. Instead, It demonstrates that their recent success was almost entirely a temporary phenomenon tied to one player's availability. Those are very different value propositions when negotiating broadcast rights. Attendance figures will tell an equally stark story. The teams that relocated games to larger venues will showcase the damage most visibly. Instead of 15,000 to 20,000 fans creating electric atmospheres and impressive television visuals, we'll see 3,000 to 5,000 people scattered throughout arenas that emphasize the emptiness. Every camera angle will highlight sections of vacant seats, creating a visual narrative of failure that's far more damaging than simply playing in appropriate-sized venues with normal attendance. The Washington Mystics relocated Baltimore game will be particularly telling. This was supposed to be a special event, a showcase of women's basketball's growing popularity in a major market. Without Clark, it's likely to become an embarrassing demonstration of how dependent that popularity was on one player. The empty seats will outnumber the attendees, and the financial loss will be substantial enough to make teams think twice about similar gambles in the future. Social media engagement metrics will decline sharply. The WNBA's recent success in generating online conversation has been overwhelmingly Clark-focused. Her highlights drove viral moments, her performances created debate and discussion, and her presence made women's basketball relevant in spaces where it had never previously registered. Without her playing, the league will likely return to minimal social media presence outside of dedicated WNBA fan communities. Sponsorship implications will develop more slowly, but potentially cause the most lasting damage. Brands that increased their WNBA partnerships based on the improved audience metrics and mainstream attention will reassess their investments. Some may honor existing contracts while deciding not to renew. Others might invoke performance clauses if agreements were tied to specific viewership or attendance benchmarks. The message will be clear. Sponsors invested in Caitlin Clark's ability to deliver audiences, not in the WNBA as an institution. To other talented athletes, highlight competitive games, and argue that the foundation for sustainable success remains strong. Media allies will echo these talking points, publishing pieces about how the WNBA's progress transcends any individual player and how true supporters should remain engaged regardless of who's on the court. None of that messaging will change the fundamental metrics. Television ratings, attendance figures, social media engagement, and ultimately revenue. These numbers don't respond to narrative framing. They reflect actual audience behavior, and that behavior is about to demonstrate definitively that Clark's impact was singular rather than representative of broader trends. Some defenders of the league will argue that boycotting fans are being unfair, that they should support women's basketball as a whole rather than fixating on one player. That argument misses the point entirely. These casual fans never signed up to be WNBA institutional supporters. They came to watch Caitlin Clark, and the league spent months suggesting that wasn't good enough. Now they're simply taking the league at its word. If Clark isn't singularly important, then her absence shouldn't matter, and these fans are free to spend their time and money elsewhere. The broader sports media will cover the collapse with a mix of genuine analysis and schadenfreude. The WNBA's recent success had generated substantial coverage, some of it laden with social and political framing about the importance of supporting women's sports. The sharp reversal when Clark goes out will undermine those narratives and provide ammunition for critics who always believed the growth was overstated and unsustainable. What should terrify WNBA executives most is the possibility that this becomes a permanent reset rather than a temporary setback. Casual fans who disengage now might not return even when Clark is healthy again. They'll have found other entertainment options, broken the habit of watching WNBA games, and potentially developed resentment toward the league that makes re-engagement unlikely. Winning back lost audiences requires exponentially more effort than maintaining existing ones. The Indiana Fever will suffer most directly in the short term through lost ticket revenue and reduced local media value. But the entire league will feel the impact through diminished national television appeal and reduced sponsor interest. This isn't just one team's problem, it's a league-wide crisis that will affect every franchise's financial performance. The most damning aspect is how completely predictable this was. Anyone paying attention to where the audience growth was actually coming from could have forecast this outcome. The WNBA chose to believe their own narrative rather than accepting the market reality. That decision is about to become very expensive, and the lessons will be taught through empty arenas and collapsed viewership numbers that can't be explained away. The WNBA is about to receive the most expensive education in sports business economics they could possibly get. For months, they insisted that their recent growth represented something bigger than Caitlin Clark, that the rising interest reflected genuine support for women's basketball as a whole. The market is about to call that bluff in the most definitive way possible. Empty seats in oversized arenas, collapsed television ratings, and organized fan boycotts will provide clarity that no amount of corporate messaging can obscure. One player was responsible for the league's unprecedented success, and her absence is revealing the uncomfortable truth that executives didn't want to acknowledge. The teams that bet millions on her drawing power are learning painful lessons about risk management. The league that downplayed her importance is discovering what their product is worth without her. And the fans who were made to feel their interest wasn't good enough are demonstrating exactly what happens when you disrespect the people driving your business. The next few weeks won't just determine how long Clark is out. They'll reveal whether the WNBA has any sustainable audience beyond her star power, and early indications suggest the answer will be devastating.